for people to come in. As you know, the meeting will be recorded, but we'll just wait a few more minutes. In the meantime, I will share the link to our publication online with you in case you have not had a chance to have a look yet. Okay, it's 10:05. I think we can start. On behalf of Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, our partners, Women Engage for a Common Future, and the European Environmental Bureau, I would like to welcome you all to our online launch on the feminist vision of a European Green Deal. As you know, today we'll present the main findings of our report on a gender-just implementation of the European Green Deal, focusing on concrete policies and recommendations in the EU's most carbon-intense sectors, which are energy, agriculture, and transportation. We are happy that so many people are interested in this event and signed up for our event ahead of International Women's Day next week. I would also like to welcome our guest speakers and partners, Laura Burkhardt and Clara Meyer. Unfortunately, Franz Timmermann was unable to join a launching event today, but I think we will have a great discussion nonetheless. Just a few technical details before we start. Our event will be short and sweet, so it's just about 1 hour, and we'll focus on the main messages of the report, which will be presented by Katharina Wiese from the European Environmental Bureau and Gabriele Köhler from Women Engage for a Common Future. As announced in the invitation, and as I've already mentioned, the meeting will be recorded. Due to the large amount of participants, you can use the chat function to ask your questions at the end, and I will be hosting that session, and I will try to include as many questions as possible at the end. I've already shared the link to our publication, which you can find here, and that link has also been shared with you in the invitation that we've sent yesterday. Now, this activity is part of a project by the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung called A Sovereign Europe, in which we develop ideas and proposals in 5 fields of action on how the European Union can become more capable and independent, thus a sovereign actor in global politics with regard to democracy and values, a socially just economy, climate and energy, peace and security, and multilateralism and geopolitics. And sadly, the importance of such a project and of a strong and sovereign Europe based on democratic and liberal norms has become all the more pressing in light of the war on Ukraine, which I believe has frightened and shocked us all in the last few days. Now, with regard to the climate crisis, the narrative for a sovereign Europe is crystal clear. in order to achieve the 1.5-degree target set out in the Paris Agreement in 2015, the European Green Deal shows a tangible path to achieve climate neutrality, which must be achieved worldwide by 2050 at the very latest. And here again, I think it has become increasingly clear in light of the current geopolitical crisis and Russia's war in Ukraine that Europe needs to become independent of the Russian fossil industry, which is in large part financing Putin's war in Ukraine. We need to invest massively in renewable energy to defend our democratic ideals. And I think to fulfill this, the EU must take a much stronger lead in implementing the European Green Deal than it has done so far. But we also know that not everyone is impacted equally by climate change, nor by the policies implemented to tackle the climate crisis, such as the European Green Deal. Now, that is why we decided to take a closer look at the gender effects of climate change and climate policies of the European Green Deal in this project. And this is where I will hand over to our first speaker, Clara Burkhardt, who will talk in more detail about our reasons for doing this project. She's been serving as a member of the European Parliament as part of the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats since 2019, and she's a member of the European Parliament's Committee on the Environment, Public Health and Food Safety. Clara, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Yvonne, and thanks a lot, of course, first of all, to the Friedrich Ebert Foundation to be ready and open to push this topic in the public debate. And also, of course, thanks a lot to the European Environmental Bureau and to Women Engaged for a Common Future to work on this with us. Because, I mean, everyone who's drawn into this meeting and to this presentation knows that climate change is not just an environmental problem, it is also a social justice problem, because we know that climate change and our response, how we tackle it, really affects everyone. We have been talking in the past 2.5 years since I'm in Parliament, we have been talking a lot on the European Green Deal, which is supposed to be a game changer in the European Union. And it is often, I noticed, reduced to the discussions about climate targets, minus 50% by 2030, climate neutrality by 2050 at the latest, and so on. But I think the Green Deal is way more, and it has to be more, because when it is implemented correctly, it really has the potential to change society and economy in a really, really profound way. And we know how important the societal impacts are of climate change, because it just has been shown again by this week's latest report by the IPCC, where it really made clear that vulnerable people are most at risk of being hit by the effects of climate crisis. The social, the health or economic status of a person really decides whether extreme weather events become a personal catastrophe. So yes, climate change and our response to tackle it really affect everyone, but it does not impact everyone equally. Women will be and already are facing increased vulnerabilities due to their different social roles, status, resources, and power. And to look at this precisely, Gabriele and Katharina will later present more issues where women face particular challenges in the ecological transition that are often hidden to many people. As they show, the European Green Deal proposes little to nothing to take that into account. So what you can say, and you have to be frank about it, right now, the European Green Deal is gender blind. And if we really want to make the claim, which is often put forward by the Commission, leave no one behind, reality, we need a broader understanding of the concept just transition at the heart of European Green Deal, because policies related to the European Green Deal that ignore gender inequalities risk to perpetuate them or even increase them in that sense. So this is why I, as a social democratic member of the European Parliament who wants to tackle both the climate crisis and the gender inequality, I wanted to find out how the European Green Deal can be implemented in a gender just manner. And I'm really happy that with the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, with Women Engaged for a Common Future and the European Environmental Bureau, I found amazing partners to draft the study we're discussing on today, looking deeper into this issue. And then, because we know that the Fit for 55 package is already there, we need to have the answers now. We need to implement gender gender-sensitive policies in the European Green Deal now. I'm very happy about this timely presentation of the study we can do, because we urgently need a feminist European Green Deal. And this is why I'm happy to start with someone I noticed to be a very dedicated fighter for climate justice and feminism. So this is why I've been following Clara Meyer for a while now. She's the press spokesperson for one of the biggest climate activist movement of the recent history. I don't have to introduce them, Fridays for Future. And your school and climate strikes are not only about climate policy in a narrow sense. Fridays for Future regularly also addresses the issues like feminism, anti-racism, and justice in general. And maybe you can tell us why and why you consider yourself also to be a feminist and a climate justice fighter.
Hi, can everyone hear me? I hope so. So my name is Clara. I'm 20 years old and I come from Berlin. And yes, I'm a climate activist with Fridays for Future. So the IPCC report was released a couple of days ago, and people always rejoice. They're always really excited, and they always have those really high expectations. People always come to me and they say, now with the next IPCC report released, people will realize that we are in this crisis. We just need more facts. And we release report after report and study after study. And it barely changes anything on in ways of policy. Because policymakers know the facts, they simply choose to ignore them. This climate crisis is not about not knowing the facts. This climate crisis is about unwillingness. Because solving the climate crisis would inevitably mean deconstructing the structures of power that made this crisis possible in the first place. But we have the facts. We know that the climate crisis is the largest crisis of inequality in decades. And it didn't arise out of thin air. It didn't arise because women aren't using menstrual cups enough instead of tampons. It was not caused by individual consumption, even though companies try to make us believe that. This crisis is based on systematic inequality and exploitation. And it can only be solved if we tackle these inequalities in the first place. One of the largest inequalities is, of course, the patriarchy. So women are less likely to have a phone globally in order to be informed when there is a climate catastrophe right in front of their doors. And when they try to leave, they're also less likely to have access to a bank account in order to have money to actually leave the place. They also farm most of the global land, but own barely any of it. So while they have to labor on the land, they're not included in any of the decision-making process, what happens with that land. They're also less likely to have an education, which means they're less likely to actually be the policymakers who have the chance to do something about the climate crisis. And that also means that they're left outside and that they're not given a seat at the table when it comes to climate decisions and policy decisions. But then, why are women so important? People often ask me, like, why does it matter who creates those climate policies? Don't we just need action and don't we just need it fast? But no, women are really important when it comes to climate policy because their needs and concerns are often overlooked. And yes, they have different concerns and needs when it comes to climate policy. For example, the EU, they love talking about funding public transportation. They never talk about the fact that women fundamentally use public transportation in a different way than men do. So historically, men have used public transportation in order to get from the suburbs into the cities where they worked and then back to the suburbs. Whereas women historically performed care work, which meant that they usually traveled within districts. And often public transportation in cities all across Europe is extremely bad when it comes from transporting actually and traveling in between districts. So if we simply talk about funding public transportation and just increasing the number of trains or their cleanliness or ticket prices, that does nothing for bringing women where they need to be. We also talk about electric cars, but we don't take into concern that no funding whatsoever would make them less elitist or less expensive in order for like for the average person or woman, and it does nothing for accessible green transportation. So if we create the solutions, and that's what Clara already mentioned, if we create the solutions while ignoring the systems of oppression behind the problem, we're actually creating more inequalities than in the first place. So what is there to do? Well, we really have to focus on marginalized people. That means women, people of color, old and young people, people of lower classes. We need to include them in decision-making processes. And on a local level, you can really support, for example, in German, we call it Finta groups. Finta in German meaning Frauen, Inter, non-binär, trans und agender Leute. In English, it means woman, inter, non-binary, trans and agender people. And there are specific climate groups where only these people have come together to fight the climate crisis, to have a safe space where their concerns are not overheard or overtalked, and where they can create, really create plans and actions and policy demands that suit their specific needs. So it's really important to support those groups on local, on a national, and on international level. And also, we really need to remember that gender is only one part of this crisis. Race, class, age, as I've already mentioned, they all play a huge role in the climate crisis. This is a colonial crisis. This is a capitalist crisis. And when we miss out one piece of this puzzle, when we choose to ignore one piece of this puzzle, we can never, ever tackle this crisis in the first place.
Very true. Thank you so much, Clara. You talked about not having the problem of analyzing and knowing about the different effects, but that it's about the lacking will to implement this knowledge also in the political instruments we are facing. And this is exactly what I also noticed in the European Parliament, that we have a good analysis, that we also have one sentence in the programs that it's also about gender equality. But when it comes to how we shape the instruments, we are lacking this. And the deep analysis on that, and you already talked about some aspects, Gabriele Köhler from Women Engaged for a Common Future and Katharine Wiese from the European Environmental Bureau observed for us. And I will hand over to you to present the key findings of our study.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to Friedrich Ebert and to all of you for being here. And I'm really happy that we can tackle these enormous issues. And let me pick up on what Clara just said, that and Clara and all of you. I think we have, as a main message from our study, that we have two key predicaments. The first is the analysis is there, but the political will is not there. Everyone in this webinar, of course, but even politicians will tend to give verbal agreement to climate catastrophe, gender inequality, etc. So that's the first thing that people are agreeing on, but they do not then the politicians do then not turn that into a political decision to actually make a fundamental, systematic, structural change. I'd also like to remind of the Agenda 2030 of the United Nations that in 2015 already agreed on leaving no one behind, as Yvonne has mentioned, on really bringing climate and social justice together. And the second point, or the second message, if we were to condense our report into two messages, so one is the disconnect between analytical awareness or scientific knowledge and political will. And the second is that, related to the European Commission, we see that there's sort of two tracks. There is a, if we can have the next slide, please, there is a commission on equality. Could we have the next slide, please? There is a commission, thank you. There is a commission on equality. There is a gender equality strategy for the whole of the European Commission and the member states. There's an anti-racism plan. There's an LGBTIQ strategy on the one hand, and then we have the European Green Deal on the other hand, which notionally is committed to climate justice, but the two don't speak to each other, they don't connect. And so our concern really with this report, and I think with all of us here in this webinar, is how can we actually integrate the two? So in our study, what we're trying to do is, first of all, speak as eco-feminists, ecological feminists, ecologically committed feminists, to see how climate change, and I think both Clara and Clara made this very clear, how they connect, that climate justice and gender justice are linked. We have an intersectional approach. And again, as Clara already mentioned, it's about gender. It's how women and men are inequitably affected by different policies. And this affects people differently depending on their economic class, on their situation, on their migration status, very, very powerful indicator of injustice within the European Union countries, age, sexual orientation, and other factors that sort of intersect with the sort of in the foreground, we're more aware of the gender injustices. And so what we would like to do with this report is help to unravel the root causes of these inequities as they are based on economic, political, social, cultural exclusion, and how can we actually address the power, as Clara very clearly said, the power hierarchy within relationships and within policies. So next slide, please, and over to Kati.
Gabriele, thanks a lot. So yeah, we wanted to also start with highlighting the fact that the European Green Deal is also still framed as a new growth strategy. So that means that the European Green Deal is not really breaking with the traditional approach of green growth, in the sense that the ecological crisis could be solved with new green technologies and green consumption, without an overall reduction actually of consumption and production levels. And this also implies lifestyle changes. And science here is very clear that decoupling economic growth from environmental pressures cannot be achieved at the scale and the speed required to actually achieve Agenda 2030, but also Paris agreements. So the transition towards a green economy as it stands now will not be enough to drastically reduce the emissions, nor to enhance gender or social justice if it strongly and only relies on technology and market mechanism. So for us, a feminist European Green Deal goes beyond policies to achieve carbon neutrality and actually aims at a systematic transformation of our economies. So we need to come to an economy that is centered around care and inclusion and well-being for people and nature, instead of just focusing on GDP growth. And also, as already mentioned by Gabriele and by Clara, this economic system must challenge the existing power imbalances and actually tackle the root causes of our current system. So inequalities, growth dependency, material exploitation, etc. Furthermore, talking about a just transition, so the European Green Deal actually stresses the importance of the social dimension and the need for a just and inclusive transition. So this is one of its main objectives. But however, if we look a bit more detail, the Commission follows a quite narrow approach with the just transition instruments, because they're mostly focused on the negative impacts of the transition on specific regions and economic sectors, so notably coal mining regions and high carbon industries. For example, when we look at the funds of the just transition mechanism, it's one of the main tools of the Commission. This flows mainly to coal regions to support them with the transition to green industries. And of course, this is very important, it's very needed, but as also said by Clara before, it risks that it will most likely benefit men in coal mining areas. Instead of having maybe a bit of a deeper analysis, who else needs special attention in a just transition and to achieve social justice. So the energy transition is actually estimated to create 18 million jobs worldwide, green jobs. But we have to ask ourselves for whom and what do we actually understand as green jobs. Another number that I would like to share is that 76% of care and health workforce are female, and care and education are two particular female-dominated sectors that we need to put at the core of the transition. And what we also would like to highlight here is that it also needs to be equally distributed between genders, because we can actually say that care jobs as such are low carbon jobs, because They're quite labor intensive and low in material requirements, and they're very vital and contribute to the well-being, resilience, and also health of our societies. Also, when we think about that climate change is most likely to put even more pressure on our healthcare system. And at the same time, education is also very important for long-term sustainability, because it provides future generations with the knowledge and also the skills to adapt to environmental challenges. So we believe that for a gender just and inclusive green transition, we really must move away from this narrow understanding of sustainability and green jobs, limit to the fields of energy and transport and digitalization, but really include all sectors that are crucial for our societies and planet. And this also includes the female-dominated sectors I mentioned before, so with special attention to that. And I think it also needs to be really clear that for a just green transition, energy transition, we really need to have and focus on energy sufficiency measures. And this also entails lifestyle changes. And I think this is also a bit of the elephant in the room that at the moment no one talks about. With that, I will hand over to Gabriele again.
Can we have the next slide, please? In our report, we address various sectors. One of them is agriculture. And as Kati has just said, we have to reimagine Europe. We have to reimagine European policy. We have to reimagine EU policies. And this applies very much also to agriculture. In the rural economy in Europe, in the EU countries, we see it's often a neglected area in the discourse on climate change, although luckily now, happily, the IPCC report that was launched yesterday also devotes a lot of attention to agriculture, rural economy, and the role of biodiversity. I think there is awareness for the decline in the diversity of animal species, but I think there is much less awareness for the issue in the European Union, such a notionally affluent geographic region, of food insecurity. 13 million people in the European Union, this is FAO data from last year, 13 million people actually live with a situation of food insecurity. The food is not secure, it's not affordable, it's not sufficiently nutritious, and most of this food insecurity is experienced by women, by children, and by marginalized people. So we have a huge issue there. The rural economy in Europe employs 22 million people, often underestimated the number of people working, and is highly gendered and highly classist. We have on the one hand the farming households, who tend to still be, husband and wife type of households, where the husband, as in the global south, also in the European Union, the husband is the owner of the property. The husband is the person who accumulates social security entitlements, pension entitlements, etc. Whereas the wife, who does the care work as well as the agricultural work, tends to be invisible both in the economic policies and in the economic situation of the family and the household. And the other part of what's happening in agriculture and farming communities is that the way agriculture is conventionally organized in the European Union, it's very much large-scale farms with a lot of equipment, a lot of mechanization, a lot of fertilizers, pesticides, chemicals, etc. And because of the way it is organized, relies a lot, the farmer household relies very heavily on seasonal labor. And these workers are marginalized, are racialized, are working in highly precarious situations with no social security, with very low incomes. And the very low incomes, by the way, also apply to a lot of the farming community. If we abstract from very large, very successful farms, the farming households are amongst the lowest income earners in the European Union. So we have now, as we mentioned, we have the European Green Deal, and then the European Green Deal has a web of other policies related to greening the economy, greening in quotation marks. One of the one very important element being the Common Agricultural Policy, which is to be adopted next year, and also a farm to fork strategy. They both mention in passing somewhere, oh, there is a gender issue, there's a social issue, but it is not integral to the thinking, to the policy thinking, to the actual explanation of what needs to be done. So our point really is that we need to have this alternative vision for agriculture. We have to reimagine agriculture. We have to make this common agriculture policy, the farm to fork strategy, all these other strategies related to the rural economy. We have to really move into rethinking what happens in the rural economy. We need smaller, biodiverse, ecological farming. We need to integrate the care work, the burden of care work, into seeing how farm households function. We need to have fair producer prices. So this means fair prices for the food, the agricultural produce that the farmers grow and the seasonal workers grow. But we also need to have fair consumer prices so that we address the food insecurity of these 13 million people who are facing problems with food prices. And we now actually in all of the European Union countries have a lot of a very high level of food price inflation. So we need to do something. The scissor is opening. And obviously the farmers need to earn more for their production. And if we move to ecological, smaller unit farming, it becomes per unit more expensive. So this has to be compensated, but this price scissor has to be compensated in a fashion that does not then negatively affect households in their food consumer role. What we're calling for is that there be mandatory social justice and gender justice conditionalities in this CAP, in this Common Agricultural Policy. Sorry, there'd be mandatory in the sense that that the monitoring would actually be at the level of the individual countries. So we would request that each EU member state has to report on how they are putting social and gender considerations, equity considerations, as well as biodiversity considerations into their policies, and to have to report on that, and to also be penalized if they don't meet the commitments that they ought to be making. We think there has to be a shift out of the way the payments are structured. There should be a ceiling on payments per farm, so that a lot of the bulk of the agricultural funding from the European Commission goes to small scale farmers, to women farmers, to young farmers, to new entrants into the farming community who want to do ecological farming, small scale farming, different kind of farming. We need technical and financial support to pay for all this, for this prosumer, this producer-consumer model that brings the interests together and bridges the gap, closes the scissor, so that we have food security, biodiversity, and climate justice. And finally, perhaps most importantly, at this moment in time, we need a really bold civil society movement for all the sectors. But in my case now, I'm making a pitch especially for policies relating to agriculture, for us to really include gender justice into, in all its dimensions, social justice into the CAP and into the agricultural thinking of the European Commission, and to really reimagine what agriculture would be about. With that, over to Kati, please. And we need the next slide, please.
Yes, thanks. So another one of the sectors that we looked into is transport. Because it represents 29% of the EU's total greenhouse gas emissions. That's also actually one of the biggest driver of air pollution in cities. I just wanted to highlight that we also have a chapter on energy and upcoming Fit for 55 and energy legislation in our report. We focused today on transport and agriculture because we felt like there was already there's some awareness on energy poverty that is a female face, etc. So we thought there's less on transport and agriculture. That's why we focused. But I invite you all to read our great chapter on energy as well, with also some concrete recommendations. So why does gender matter? Clara also already gave some good examples. It matters because the mobility systems are not gender neutral. They are dominated by masculine norms. Men and women have different mobility patterns. So as Clara mentioned, men are more likely to use individualized private modes of transport, whereas women tend to use public transport more, and also research shows that they opt more for the sustainable modes of transport. These are, of course, also linked to the structural inequalities of our patriarchal society. So, yeah, it's nothing new, and also mentioned before that women still need to take the bulk of the care work, and this, of course, also influences the way they travel. So, as Clara mentioned, women do more individual, shorter trips, which is called trip chaining, whereas men tend to do more commuting from and to the workplace. How is this reflected in current European Green Deal policies? DEC or the Commission commits to gender mainstreaming in all its policies, so there is a clear commitment, and this also goes for transport. And we looked here into the Smart and Sustainable Mobility Strategy, which was released in 2020 and comes with 82 initiatives, an action plan of 82 initiatives. And when we look at this strategy, which aims is really to make the transport sector more sustainable, more resilient, one concrete aim is also to make the transport sector more attractive for women to work in. So the Commission launched this Women in Transport, or EU platform, to share best practices and connect different stakeholders. And the idea is really also to, with this strategy, to focus on continuing this. But if we look at the Smart Sustainable Mobility Strategy in more detail, it really felt to be a game changer for different reasons. So the first reason is that gender is only mentioned in terms of employment, but of course we also need to have concrete measures and actions how to actually enhance gender equality in the transport sector as user as well as worker. Second, the strategy focuses largely on electrical cars, electrical buses, high-speed trains, and aviation. So basically just greening the infrastructure we have now without direction or measures how we can actually shift to more sustainable modes of transport. So also mentioned by Clara, it really continues to prioritize private and individualized mobility and aviation over other more sustainable modes of transport and infrastructure that would benefit a larger group of society. And third, we also really miss concrete measures or recommendations how we can actually increase the safety of women and people in vulnerable situations, which is often a concern when choosing modes of transport. So, for example, there's no reference to social aspects when talking about the role of digitalization in transport, which is seen as a vital role for the transition. And here we could think about measures how to address sexist or racist patterns of algorithms of mobility products, for example, when we think about autonomous cars. So it becomes clear that the EU transport system is neither sustainable nor socially just, and the sustainable, smart and sustainable mobility strategy is also too weak to really be, to turn the wheel here. And we need more ambitious and more profound structural changes. So what we recommend in our report is, first of all, to massively expand the public sector, to make it more fair, affordable, safe, and accessible. And then also very important is to apply sufficiency perspective by reducing the need for transport and commuting. And I think the 15-minute city concept is also a good example here how this could be implemented. Then also very important that we need to start shifting the money and funding from polluting transport sectors towards cleaner and more public mobility solutions, and also start being serious about banning environmental harmful subsidies when we think about the tax breaks for aviation fuels. And last but not least, to promote policies that make it also easier for someone who uses a car or private modes of transport to actually switch to other more sustainable alternatives. And here we can think about different tariffs or services beyond the peak hours, etc. Because what we see right now, if the public transport sector is unattractive and underfunded, women who actually use this switch to private modes of transport. I think this is also something, that's important to be highlighted here. And next slide, please. So we wanted to conclude here with some horizontal recommendations that we have next to our sectoral recommendations that you can find in the report on agriculture, transport, and energy. To align the European Green Deal with the Union of Equality strategy and to really achieve a gender transformative European Green Deal. So first of all, we have also to challenge the existing norms that work against gender equality, and this here can be done through campaigns, awareness raising, etc. Another important thing is to make social and gender equality conditionalities explicit and mandatory for all policies. So this should come with mandatory assessment of social and gender impact measures. Could be something similar we saw perhaps with the national recovery and resilience plans, where we had the conditionalities on digital and environment. Another thing is, or important thing is that in order to inform policy, we need data, and we have a clear problem with data at the moment. So the collection of gender distributed data within its an intersectional perspective is key and should be uptaken. We also should have or introduce systematic gender budgeting to make the allocation of funds and the impact on gender equality also more visible. Another important thing also highlighted by previous speakers is representation. So in order to participate, one needs to be recognized as well. So we need measures to ensure gender balanced representation in negotiations, in decision-making processes, but also in environmental policy making and participation on all levels in more general. This, of course, always also applies to the environmental movement as such too. And then to address some of the root causes or economic inequalities, we also need policies that address those. So how can we eliminate the pay and the pension gap? And how can we more actively promote the diversification of the workforce, as the transport sector, energy sector, all this more male-dominated sectors are highly gendered in the sense there are more men and women. And then also, how can we give care work a more prominent role? How can we center the economy around care? How can we redistribute unfair care work in our society? And also, to reorient the policy goals away from GDP growth towards well-being through replacing indicators or channel funding to on public investment to these more female-dominated low-carbon sectors. Thank you very much. And we're looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Kati. Thanks, Gabriele, for a great presentation focusing on some of the sectors that are actually less spotlighted at the moment, as we usually tend to focus a lot on the energy sector first. So I think that's great that we try to focus on some of the other sectors where we maybe see more potential, but maybe these sectors are also a bit more invisible. Thanks also to Clara and Lara for your inputs. We already got a great range of questions in the chat, and I would start asking the questions, but I would also like to encourage our participants, if you have more questions, don't be shy. Please write them in the chat, and I will try to cover as many of the questions as I can before we close the session. So the first question is from Alba Perez from Oxfam, and she's asking, how can we use the agreements and decisions achieved under the UNFCCC framework to force the European Green Deal to be more feminist in terms of the legal tools, the ratification, and the financial instruments? Now, I'm guessing that is a question that is for all of you. So whoever wants to go first, please do.
Maybe I can do a first attempt. I think that's a very important point. Just like we have this disconnect with the European Commission's policies, some of them on gender and social justice, the others on climate and other topics. this disconnect. We have the same, that we have all these different fora. We have excellent work happening in the different UN agencies, UNFCCC, but also the Commission on the Status of Women, Commission on Social Standards, etc., and the ILO conventions, and we don't bring this together. And the same countries that have ratified some of these agreements, or that have ratified the Paris Agreement, we don't really systematically hold them to account when they're doing, for instance, EC policies, and it really all has to be connected. But I'd really like to throw that ball to our member of parliament, please. Maybe you can say something on how technically and legally, or how do you say it, in legal functions, you can use, for instance, the COP negotiations to push forward EU policies and EC policies.
I mean, we see that everything what is happening right now under the Green Deal is referred to as fulfilling international obligations, but we know still that it's not sufficient in that sense. So, I mean, it's a little bit the egg chicken situation, that where to start, where the problem of implementation begins. So I think I think all of the best of what, for example, the DG Envy is doing when they are drafting, for example, the Fit for 55 package, and they might also have this in mind. And we also, when we have positions being made as parliament, we refer to the Paris Agreement, and still we don't make the right implementation of what it would mean to implement it. And so what is helping, I think, is, and this is what you're also referring to, and what I see where things are moving on a technical level here in the decision making, is that when we have data, when we have concrete analysis on how the impact of a regulation is in a gendered sense putting in place. And this is the data we are right now missing. And this is what is blocked by especially conservative forces, because every step we are taking in the Green Deal, everyone is always, especially from the conservative side, is referring to, we need an impact assessment first. We need to know how the situation will change on the ground. So this is a little bit the problem, that the lack of data when it comes to gendered effects of our climate policies is a huge problem in the implementation and the policy making. And it gives also it is lacking to have a powerful tool to also convince colleagues that might not have a feminist identity in their hearts to then also vote for regulations that put the feminist agenda in their hearts. So this is what I think is a very important point, the technical problem, that we are kind of lacking the data on how we can target gender effects of climate policies.
Thank you. And we do have a lot more questions. So if you don't mind, I would like to turn back to the other questions so that we can cover as many as possible. A second question was asked by Eva Londra, and she's referring to a comment that Clara made. And she's saying, Clara made a very good point about women having different needs. She gave the example of women using public transport differently because of the unpaid care work duties that still largely fall on women. But how do we go about advocating and changing policies without reinforcing gender stereotypes? So Clara, would you like to comment on that?
So as I said, it's really important to put women at the table, you know, that they are part of the policymakers and not just women that belong to a certain class. So it's no use to us if 50 educated college women that have never actually lived or worked in the city in terms of like what most people work, like let's say they have never worked in a job that earns them 30,000 euros a year and have never done that sort of care work. If only those women are at the table, that's no use to us. That's not intersectionality, because that's what we're aiming at. We're aiming at an intersection of race, class, gender, and many other, you know, factors that affect how we experience this crisis. So if we actually put those people at a table, and for example, I live in Berlin, if we were to actually put people from all kinds of backgrounds, ethnicities, races, class, etc., at one table and ask them, what are your needs? What are your transportation needs? Maybe they wouldn't say that we needed a train to the Tesla factory, but maybe they'd say something very different. So that is really where we need to start. We need to act locally, and we really need to include the people that use the public transportation, for example.
Thanks, Clara. We have another great question that is making reference to the sort of intersectional perspective that a lot of you have mentioned that is also very important to the report. Nadia Haddad from the European Network on Independent Living is asking, how can we ensure through all what exists that an intersectional approach is guaranteed? And she's making reference to women with disabilities and their meaningful participation in climate justice. Now, who would like to answer that question?
I can start. I think this also actually relates back to what Lara said before, the lack of intersectional data. So first of all, I think we need this not to collect data of men, women, non-binary, but also, okay, like how does it intersect with race or disability, etc. And then I think we say intersectionality now, and we know what it means, but I think a lot of people also don't actually know what it means. So I think the first step is also to create awareness why this is important. Because what we see sometimes now is that there's acknowledgement of, for example, that climate policies is gendered, but then the policies are still framed in a quite non-binary way. So it's either man or woman, but how can we be inclusive and how can we go a step further? So yeah, it's not so difficult to answer, but I think awareness raising, participation. I mean, if we design transport policies, people with disabilities, for example, need to be included, because often cities, I mean, also if you think about Brussels, it's really not a great place, I think, for someone in a wheelchair, and a friend of mine is in a wheelchair, and I think it's really, yeah, she cannot even visit us. So I think this is just, again, a lack of participation and recognition. But maybe others want to add.
We don't have much time left, and we have a lot of questions left. So if there's nothing urgent to add, I would actually suggest we move on to the next question so that we can cover as many as possible in the very few minutes that we have left. But if there's anything urgent you would like to add, please let me know. Okay, we have another question from, let me see here, from Vicky Corbels. She works for Seikant, which is a coalition of progressive feminists in Flanders. And they are working on building bridges between the most climate change vulnerable women and girls and businesses and industries that are working on green jobs. And she is asking where she can find subsidies, funding to go ahead with this project. And she's asking for concrete advice on how to continue with her work. Any ideas?
Maybe it's a more technical question. You can just email me, and I will try to find your people who can help you with that.
I wanted to say the same, because there are some associations which also, or there's a new pool of funds. They support feminist movements, also rather small. So yeah, maybe you can just drop us an email and we can share this.
Yeah, we have another question that's going in a similar direction, but it's a bit more policy oriented, from someone from a Portuguese NGO. She's asking how we can go forward at the national level to increase our voices together. Now we're talking about the European Union, but what are concrete steps that can be taken at the national level?
Should I make a quick point there? This is exactly why I think the study is so important, because right now we give the funds from the European Green Deal with no strings attached when it comes to the question of climate justice and how it's implemented in a gender just managed way. And I think this is what we have to achieve here, that we have the programs of the Green Deal and all the funds that are mobilized with it connected to that question. And this is why I think we have to do it. And we see that the implementation and also the reach of the programs is highly dependent on that people on the ground are aware of the possibilities that the funds can give you and also have access to it. So I think this is why we have to have the discussion on the Feminist Green Deal, not only on a European level, but especially on a national and regional level when it comes to the implementation.
I'll just add one sentence from one of my interview partners who said, and it refers to what all of you have been saying, how can we actually have progressive policies if we don't have progressive thinkers at the table, and progressive being, of course, intersectional, gender aware, climate justice aware people. And so I think in the implementation, we owe a lot to Clara and the Parliament, but the implementation, actually, we need civil society to be really forceful at the national level and claim our rights, claim climate justice and gender justice on the ground, literally.
Great, thank you. And we actually have a follow-up question. Now we're moving from the national level to sort of the local level. And Diana Duarte from ICLEI Europe is asking, how can we integrate gender justice into our own workplaces? So this is sort of like the next level, right? We're talking about the EU, we're talking about the national level, and now we're talking about very concrete steps that can be taken at the workplace. Who would like to answer that question?
I mean, maybe I can say a bit how we went about in the EB. So what we are, I mean, also, I think, again, awareness raising is the first step. So yeah, it's vital to talk to colleagues, to maybe have, I don't know, we did some thematic lunches to kind of show why it's important within the organization, outside of the organization. And then I think what's also important is to maybe develop some sort of like guidelines. So we had a gender equality strategy or policy, and now that's been revised to also be more intersectional. It's called diversity and equality strategy. So this is something you can start developing. There are also lots of organizations who have already done this. So I think it's also important to network with other organizations and to exchange. I think there also within the EU NGO bubble and environmental bubble, there has also been several discussions, especially also to make the environmental movement more diverse or to create awareness. Yeah, I think for me, these are some of the first steps. Also, it takes time. Sometimes you think, oh yeah, you can do this in 2 months, but I think you also, we have to acknowledge that this is a process as well.
Yeah, I'm actually a bit hesitant to take another answer because we have about 5 questions left and it's already 11 o'clock. So Gabriela, if you don't mind, I would like to come to the other questions. We have another question that is on basically, well, I'm just going to read it out. In light of the fact that even in the EU, there is an anti-gender movement, are there views of how the recommendations should be taken forward? What can we do together to support that the recommendations are actually realized? What is the key to unlocking the way towards a feminist future? Gabriela, maybe you would like to go first here. Yeah.
One of my pet project is really gender budgeting, because I think when we see how monies from the European Commission in this case, or from government ministries in the national, how they are spent, it often is like a wake-up call to men and women and to the different social classes. So I think that's one very useful instrument, and I can't repeat often enough the importance of civil society. Just have to keep on banging the pots and raising awareness. But it's difficult. And just very quickly, I think we also really need to see the role of men in the care economy. I have a male colleague who refuses to have meetings after 5 p.m. And if the meeting drags on, he says, I'm sorry, I have to go and pick up my child from kindergarten. And that it's so much more powerful. Unfortunately, it's so much more powerful than if a woman colleague says the same thing.
But I also think, just to add on that, it's a question of, I mean, it's not a breaking news for marginalized people that money is is very spread differently. So this is unequally. This is a problem. But what I think we have to watch out, especially in the anti-gender movement and also in the climate skepticism movement that are really much connected ideologically wise, is that we see right now also in the European Parliament that conservative forces kind of see or have a breakthrough in their seeing the social effects of the climate policies and want to use it to push down ambition. But we have to make clear as feminists that postponing the ambitiousness of the policies is what especially will come worse for women and marginalized group in general. So this is what we, I think, have to watch out and have to challenge also to the anti-gendered and the anti-climate movement to make sure that they don't postpone the necessary action just because they want to protect fossil fuel interests, but we want to put the well-being of people in these policies and not make it as a tool they use to put their ideology in these policies.
Yeah, maybe just to throw in a follow-up question that works quite well here. Is there any way in which you would prioritize the vast set of recommendations that you've come up with in terms of what needs to be done first to sort of unlock this way toward a feminist green future?
Conditionalities.
That was a short answer. So if anyone else would like to comment, please feel free to do so before we move on to the next question.
I think Clara had her hands like now 3 times. Maybe you want to.
I was for the question before that. I just wanted to mention and highlight that we don't all have the same privileges when it comes to talking about the climate crisis. So whenever either whether it's the workplace or school or even parliament or even the job that I do, which is, you know, do press work and hold speeches, we don't all have the same privileges to actually talk about the really pressing issues. So when my male colleague says something radical about the climate crisis and what we have to do, he's not as reprimanded as when I do the same thing. And I, as a white woman, have more privileges to have those uncomfortable conversations in the workplace, in parliament, in wherever I go than, let's say, a woman of color. So really, we have to use our privileges, that we have to have those uncomfortable conversations about climate and feminism.
Thank you. That's a great point, and that actually brings me to another question that I saw in the chat about global solidarity and global gender and climate justice. The question is, what do you see as the role of the European Green Deal in supporting major financial transfers to countries of the global south as compensation for the loss and damage created by climate change? And I think we can see clearly with the IPCC report that this is going to increase and this is going to need more attention, right?
Again, just
Gabriele and then Clara, maybe.
Just one sentence. In this particular study, we didn't look at the inequities versus the global south. The EU's global footprint in every way is enormous: climate, resource use, etc. And basically colonial patterns persist. So that has to be addressed. But we didn't in the study. We didn't go into that. But I think that would be maybe FVS. Can that be our next study?
Clara.
So a Green New Deal that only focuses on white European women is in no way feminist. It's not feminist if white women oppress women of color in the global south in any dimension. So if we do not focus on really reducing and destroying all forms of colonialist, racist, sexist oppression that we all have benefited from as European people, then this deal is not in any form feminist.
Clara.
Maybe just to put it back to the start, why we conducted the study, in a sense, is that we see, especially when it comes to the feminist discussion on climate crisis, we have a lot of analysis on the inequalities, especially European production and consumption produces, especially to the global south. And we know that all the climate movements we are seeing, they come from people, from indigenous people, from indigenous movements who stepped up because they were affected by the actions of the European Union. And I think that in some points, we already address it in the European Green Deal, the external dimension, by talking about supply chain acts and also seeing the human rights violations we are doing with our consumption of those different commodities, etc. So I think there is a link on it. But of course, this also has to strengthen the gender dimension. I think it's a good idea to have a follow-up study on that. What we really didn't find at all is how the Green Deal with its inner its commitment into the European climate policies, we don't see the gendered effects within the European Union. So I think it's both. And this is how I think feminist politics work. Of course, it's on the one hand, fighting the sources of inequalities within the European Union, but of course also then looking at the global footprint we leave. So it's a big, big task. It's not connected to European borders because the climate crisis is not. But this is maybe just to give you the motive why we wanted to go here to the question of the European Green Deal as a policy framework. But of course, we need to also address it on a global scale and our effects.
Thank you, Clara. We have a last set of questions on mobility and transport, which I think fit nicely together. Referring to mobility, shouldn't we rethink the structure of paid labor? Wouldn't it relieve the pain of the daily commute if we had more home office options, or rather quarter-based community offices that can be reached by walking or by biking within 15 minutes, leaving kids in the kindergarten or on the way? And we have a follow-up question, I think that fits nicely. Should we be thinking of special wagons for women in metros? Such a system exists in Japan. I know it also exists in Mexico. Would this be an idea to introduce in Europe? So last set of questions on mobility and transport. Clara.
Yeah, so first of all, we need different options of like just performing work. Home office has become a viable option for a lot of people during the pandemic, but also someone mentioned the 15-minute city, which is really just, which is really just a great concept, because it's necessary for most people to reach the kindergarten, the school, the doctor's office, and all the things they need in their daily lives within 15 minutes. But then also we need to recognize that the care work women do, and with which they travel across the city, is unpaid. So really that there was, I think Laurel Penny said it, that if we were to pay the care work that women do, our world will basically just fall apart, because we are using this unpaid labor in order to hold our society together. And if we actually recognize this care work as real, substantial, and necessary labor in society, then that will give women much more resources, and that will also be, it all comes together. The modes of transportation, recognizing the work that women are doing, and then giving them the resources to fulfill the tasks that they, or well, hopefully men, will perform in society.
Yeah, I just wanted to add again that I think we need to highlight that we need sufficiency measures, not only for the energy transition, but it also goes for transport. So how can we reduce the transport or the ways of transport in more general? Also, how do we actually get fit for a post-growth world, considering that we cannot grow forever and that decoupling is a myth? That also means we need to change the way we're working right now. I think actually we need to work less, and then also see how then the work that is freed for meaningful activities is actually not shouldered on women again. So how can we make care work a bit more equally distributed among society? And also how to give care more resource and prominences to care as well. I think that connects again to the wider systemic issues that the European Green Deal is embedded in.
I really endorse that point about working less as one option. And just to say that home office is extremely CO2 intensive, because more and more people are using the internet. So we need to really get away from romanticizing that.
Thank you. That was all. We've covered all of the questions. We're about 10 minutes behind schedule, but I said that I would promise that we cover as many questions as possible. So we did that. So I really think I have nothing left to say other than to thank you all for your excellent contributions, for a great seminar. I think we really did the publication justice with this. And last but not least, I would also like to advertise for our next event, right? Because if this is something that is of interest to you, we will have a follow-up activity in the context of the Commission on the Status of Women on March 15th, where we will once again dive a little deeper into the subject. We'll have a bit more time, and we'll have breakout groups on the different sectors. We will also, because we've mentioned this, have different perspectives from the Global South that will be included in the seminar. So it will be more of an interactive sort of workshop type seminar. So if you're interested, I encourage you to sign up for this. And I will share the link to the meeting with you in the chat. So please, if this is of interest, please feel free to join us for our next seminar on the Feminist European Green Deal. I wish you all a great day. Stay healthy, stay safe, and thanks for joining.